The dawn was a thief, stealing the night's comfortable shadows and leaving the world raw and exposed. It crept through the grimy window of the cottage, a pale, watery light that smelled of salt and damp earth. It was the hour Alistair had once associated with duty, with drills and inspections, with the cold bite of a bit in a horse's mouth. Now it was just the end of another sleepless night on a journey that felt endless. He stood before the low stone wall, the sea churning a restless gray behind him, and stared at the one place his long search had led, a cottage barely more than a hovel, clinging to the cliffside like a limpet to a rock. This was where she lived, his Duchess, in a place where the wind scoured the paint from the door and the thatch was heavy with moss. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, in the fever dreams of a field hospital, in the gnawing emptiness of a foreign prison, on the rolling deck of the ship that finally brought him home. He had imagined sweeping her into his arms, the scent of her lavender soap, the feel of her silk dress against his rough uniform. He had imagined relief, tears, a homecoming. He had not imagined this, the cold, grinding reality of it, the 6 years he had lost, the life she had been forced to build from the ashes he had left behind. His hand, scarred and unsteady, rose to knock. The wood was rough beneath his knuckles. He was a stranger here, a ghost at the door of his own life. The sound was shockingly loud in the morning stillness. He heard a stirring inside, a soft shuffling. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner. The bolt scraped back. The door opened a crack, and in the space stood a small boy, no older than 5 or 6. He had a thatch of dark, unruly hair and a serious, guarded expression. But it was his eyes that stopped Alistair's breath. They were his own, a deep, impossible blue, the color of a winter sky, the Wyndham eyes that had stared back from portraits for 500 years. The boy blinked, unafraid, merely curious. He clutched a wooden soldier in one hand. With the other, he pushed the door wider, and Alistair saw it. Hanging from a piece of twine around the child's thumb, gleaming dully in the weak light, was his ducal signet ring. The heavy gold, the carved griffin, the onyx stone he had last seen on his own finger the day he rode off to war. The world tilted, the sound of the sea rushing in his ears. This was not possible. This was a hallucination, a final trick of a mind long tormented. "Mama!" the boy called over his shoulder, his voice clear as a bell. "There's a man at the door. He looks sad." Then she was there, moving from the shadows of the cottage into the light. Alara. Her hair was not coiffed in intricate braids, but tied back simply with a ribbon. Her dress was not silk, but coarse, faded wool. Her hands, once soft and pale and fit for nothing more strenuous than embroidery, were chapped and reddened. She was thinner, the delicate bones of her face more pronounced, and in her eyes was a weariness that had not been there before. But it was her, the same straight nose, the same gentle curve of her mouth. She froze, her hand flying to her throat. The color drained from her face, leaving it as white as sea foam. Her eyes, those soft gray eyes that had haunted his every waking moment, widened in disbelief, then in a terror so profound it struck him like a physical blow. "No," she whispered, the word a mere breath of air. "It cannot be." She thought him a ghost. He could see it in the frantic pulse at the base of her throat. He took a step forward, his legs stiff and aching. "Elira!" His voice, rough from disuse and the raw sea air, broke the spell. The terror in her eyes hardened, calcifying into something cold and sharp. She pushed the boy behind her, a fiercely protective gesture that lanced Alistair's heart. "You are not him," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength with every word. "My husband is dead. He died a hero. He did not abandon us." Abandon. The word was a blade. It cut through the fog of his exhaustion, the shock of seeing his son, and laid bare the chasm between them. 6 years, a lifetime. To him it was a nightmare of survival. To her it was an eternity of betrayal. This was not a homecoming. It was a reckoning. And it had only just begun. Before the war, their life had been a masterpiece of gilded misery. Wyndham Court was not a home. It was a monument, a vast and echoing testament to centuries of power and duty. Its corridors were cold, even in summer, smelling of beeswax and old stone and the faint, cloying scent of roses slowly dying in porcelain vases. The air was thick with expectation, heavy with the weight of portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow Alara's every move, judging her, finding her wanting. Alistair, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, moved through this world as if born to it, which, of course, he was. He wore his title like a suit of well-oiled armor, deflecting emotion, intimacy, and anything that could be perceived as weakness. He was a man forged by duty, his days dictated by the management of his vast estates, his nights by the tedious rituals of society. He was handsome, respected, powerful, and he was a stranger to his own wife. Alara remembered their wedding day not as a blur of joy, but as a series of rigid, formal tableaus. The weight of the Wyndham diamonds on her neck, the scratch of the ancient lace veil, the cool, impersonal touch of Alistair's hand as he placed his ring. That ring, the one now on her son's thumb, on her finger. She had been a suitable match, the daughter of an earl with an impeccable bloodline and a quiet disposition. She had been chosen, not wooed, a broodmare for the next generation of dukes. Their marriage was a silent, aching void. They slept in adjoining chambers, a door between them that was always closed. They dined together, the length of the polished mahogany table a vast, unbridgeable distance. Their conversations were stilted exchanges about the weather, estate matters, the latest political gossip. He never asked what she thought, what she felt, what she dreamed of in the lonely hours of the night. He saw her, she knew, as another one of his responsibilities. The Duchess, a necessary component of his life, to be maintained and presented to the world, but not to be known. His cousin, Lord Valerius, was the opposite. Where Alistair was granite, Valerius was mercury. He was all charm and sympathetic smiles, his eyes lingering on Alara a moment too long during dreary family dinners. He would appear at her side in the gardens, his voice a low murmur of concern. "His Grace is so consumed by his duties," he would say, shaking his head with a show of regret. "He forgets he has a wife, a beautiful, brilliant wife." He was poison wrapped in velvet. Alara felt it, a prickle of instinct she could not name, but she was so starved for a kind word, for any sign of personal interest, that she allowed his presence. He was a small warmth in the perpetual chill of her life. She did not see the resentment that simmered behind his eyes, the covetous gaze he cast upon the house, the title, the life that should have been his, had his father been born 10 minutes sooner. The announcement of war was a tremor that shook the foundations of their static world. Alistair, a man who had never faced a challenge greater than a tenant dispute, felt a call to duty that was absolute. It was in his blood. His ancestors had fought for kings and queens. Their swords hung in the great hall. He would not be the first Wyndham to shirk his responsibility. He told her in his study, the room dark with oak paneling and the smell of leather-bound books he never read. He did not ask her opinion. He informed her of his decision, as he would his estate manager. "I have accepted a commission with the Royal Dragoons. I leave at the end of the month." She stood before his massive desk, a small, pale figure in the cavernous room. For the first time, a crack appeared in her composure. "You will go yourself? You could fund a dozen men in your place. Your duty is here." He looked up from his papers, his blue eyes cool and remote. "My duty is to the crown. Valerius will manage the estates in my absence. You will be well looked after." He had dismissed her, her fear, her protest, her very existence. She was a logistical matter to be arranged. In that moment, something inside her, something that had been slowly freezing for 2 years, finally turned to ice. She did not plead. She did not weep. She simply nodded, a perfect porcelain duchess, and walked out of the room, the door closing behind her with a soft, final click. In the weeks before he left, a new tension settled over the house. Alara found herself plagued by a strange exhaustion, a recurring nausea she blamed on the stress of his impending departure. She barely saw him. He was consumed by preparations, by meetings with lawyers and military tailors. The night before he was to leave, he came to her chambers. The connecting door, always closed, swung open. He stood there, silhouetted in the candlelight, already a stranger in his new, severe uniform. He seemed uncertain, as if he had forgotten the way. "Alara?" She sat at her vanity, brushing her hair, the silver-backed brush heavy in her hand. She did not turn. "Your Grace." He walked into the room, the scent of polish from his boots filling the air. He stopped behind her, his reflection joining hers in the mirror. They looked like two figures from a painting, impossibly close, yet utterly separate. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder before falling back to his side. He began, then stopped. The words would not come. He had no language for this. He had been taught to command, to legislate, to rule. He had not been taught to speak to his own wife. He cleared his throat. "I am leaving this with you." He placed his signet ring on the polished surface of her vanity. The gold was warm from his skin. "Keep it safe for me." It was not a request for love or a promise of return. It was a transfer of property, an instruction. She stared at the ring, the proud griffin seeming to mock her. This was all he had to give her, a symbol of the title that owned them both. "I will," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. He lingered for a moment longer, a silent, imposing statue. Then he turned and left, closing the door behind him. She listened to his footsteps recede down the hall until there was only the sound of the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, measuring out the seconds of her empty life. She did not know then that she was carrying his son. 3 months after he left, the first letter arrived. It was brief, formal, describing the weather and the poor quality of the roads. It was addressed to the Duchess of Blackwood and signed Blackwood. It could have been written to his solicitor. The second letter was much the same. Then nothing. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. Valerius was a constant presence, his concern a suffocating blanket. He brought her news from the papers, his expression grave as he read of brutal battles and mounting casualties. He intercepted the post, claiming he did not want to upset her with official estate business. He slowly, methodically, isolated her. The doctor had confirmed her condition. She was with child. A fragile, secret joy flickered within her. An heir. This would change everything. This would give her purpose, a connection to Alistair that was real, not just ceremonial. She wrote to him immediately, a frantic, hopeful letter, pouring out her heart in a way she never had before. She told him of the heir, of her hopes for their future, of her prayers for his safe return. She gave the letter to Valerius to post, trusting him. The letter never left the estate. The day the official dispatch arrived, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening a storm. Valerius brought the letter to her himself, his face a mask of practiced sorrow. It was from the War Office. The black seal was stark against the cream parchment. Her hands did not shake as she broke it. She had been holding her breath for so long, she had forgotten how to breathe. The words were cold, impersonal. "Regret to inform you. His Grace, Alistair Wyndham, killed in action, gallantly leading his men." The world did not shatter. It simply ceased to exist. The air in her lungs turned to glass. The sound of Valerius's voice, murmuring condolences, was a distant buzzing, like a trapped fly against a window pane. She felt nothing, a profound, absolute numbness that was a mercy. She was a porcelain doll, and all her sawdust had just leaked out. Alistair was dead. The stranger she was married to, the father of the child she carried, was gone, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The days that followed were a blur of black crepe and hushed voices. Valerius took control. He was the new duke now, a role he slipped into with unnerving ease. He managed the funeral arrangements, accepted the condolences, and stood beside her at the empty grave, where they buried a coffin filled with rocks and soil from the Wyndham estate. He was a pillar of strength. He was a vulture. He moved into the master chambers. The connecting door to her room was locked from his side. She was a prisoner in her own home. The staff, loyal to the title and not the person, now answered to him. One evening he came to her sitting room. He did not knock. He poured himself a brandy from the decanter, his movements proprietary, familiar. "You are looking pale, Ilara," he said, swirling the amber liquid. "Mourning does not become you." "What do you want, Valerius?" she asked, her voice flat. He smiled, a thin, unpleasant curving of his lips. "I have been thinking of the future, of the estate. The line must be secured. It is a tragedy you did not provide Alistair with an heir." The blood ran cold in her veins. He knew. He must have known. The letter she had written. "As his widow," he continued, his eyes gleaming, "you hold a certain sentimentality, but a grieving widow is a liability. A new duchess is required. However, I am a compassionate man. After a suitable period of mourning, you and I shall be wed. It is the neatest solution. The title remains consolidated. You retain your position. No one will question it." Nausea, the same she'd felt in the early weeks of her pregnancy, rose hot and acidic in her throat. Marry him? This man who looked at her with the eyes of a collector appraising a new acquisition? This man who was already erasing her husband from his own home? "No," she whispered. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You misunderstand. It was not a proposal. It is an arrangement. You have no choice. You are a woman alone. You have nothing. Everything you see," he gestured around the opulent room, "is mine." He took a step closer, his cologne acrid and sweet. "Do not fight me, Ilara. You will find I am not as patient as my cousin." That night, she did not sleep. She lay in the dark, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, and for the first time since reading the news of Alistair's death, she felt something other than numb grief. It was a cold, pure, diamond-hard rage. He would not have her child. He would not have her. She would not be a piece of property passed from one duke to the next. She made her decision in the hour before dawn, the darkest and quietest time. Action was the only antidote to despair. She rose from her bed and dressed not in mourning black, but in the simplest, sturdiest traveling dress she owned. She did not look at the jewels in their velvet boxes. They were shackles. She did not pack the fine clothes in their scented wardrobes. They were a costume. She went to her vanity and opened a small, hidden drawer. Inside was a leather pouch containing the household money she managed. A modest sum, but enough. Her eyes fell on the signet ring Alistair had left. It sat heavy and cold on the polished wood. For a moment, she thought of leaving it, the last symbol of the life she was escaping. But then she thought of the child inside her. This was his birthright, the only thing of his father's he might ever have. She slipped it into the pouch. She moved through the sleeping house like a phantom, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floors. The portraits watched her go, their painted gazes impassive. She did not look back. She let herself out a small side door used by the gardeners, the iron latch cold and stiff beneath her hand. The air outside was damp and smelled of rain and wet earth. Freedom. It was terrifying. She walked the 2 miles to the nearest village, her heart pounding with every snap of a twig, every rustle in the hedgerows. At the coaching inn, she paid for a seat on the first mail coach heading west, not caring about its destination, only that it was away. She gave her name as Mrs. Ellery, the first name that came to mind. As the coach rattled away, the rising sun illuminated the distant spires of Wyndham Court. Lady Alara, Duchess of Blackwood, was gone. In her place was a pregnant widow with a few sovereigns in her pocket and a future as blank and uncertain as the morning mist. The journey was a blur of exhaustion and fear. She traveled for days, changing coaches, always moving west, towards the sea, as if its vastness could swallow her past. She ended up in Porthgallo, a small fishing village in Cornwall, a place so remote and inconsequential, she felt she could finally disappear. The village clung to a granite cliff, a tangle of narrow, winding streets and whitewashed cottages that smelled perpetually of salt, fish, and coal smoke. The people were hardened by the sea, their faces weathered, their hands calloused. They were suspicious of outsiders, but a widow with a sad story and a willingness to work was eventually accepted into the rough fabric of the community. She rented a tiny, damp cottage on the cliff's edge. It had 2 rooms, a leaking roof, and a view of the endless, churning sea. It was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. Here, she was not the Duchess. She was Alara, just Alara. Her son was born in that cottage during a fierce autumn gale, with the help of a local midwife, whose hands were as rough as barnacles but surprisingly gentle. She named him Arthur. He was small but perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes the color of his father's. He was her anchor, her purpose, her entire world. Life was brutally hard. The money she had brought ran out quickly. She learned to work. She took in mending from the fishermen's wives, her delicate fingers, once practiced in fine embroidery, growing numb and calloused from darning thick wool and patching canvas sails. She learned to cook on an open fire, to haggle for fish at the docks, to make a shilling last a week. She grew thin, but she grew strong. The soft, pliable girl who had walked the halls of Wyndham Court was gone, scoured away by salt wind and hard labor. In her place was a woman of quiet, unyielding resilience. She told Arthur his father had been a soldier, a duke, a great man who had died in the war. She showed him the signet ring, his only legacy. He would slip it onto his thumb, where it was impossibly large, and stare at the carved griffin with solemn wonder. It was a fairy tale, a story of a lost kingdom. It was safer than the truth. Years passed, 6 of them. Arthur grew from a baby into a bright, inquisitive boy. He was a child of the sea, sure-footed on the treacherous cliff paths, his laughter mingling with the cry of the gulls. He had her quiet nature but his father's stubborn chin. He was the sun in her small, circumscribed universe. She was no longer lonely. She was not happy, not in the way she had once understood the word, but she was content. She had survived. She had protected her son. It was enough. For Alistair there was no contentment, only pain. He had not died in a gallant charge. He had been cut down, his horse shot from under him, his leg shattered by a musket ball. He had woken in a haze of agony in a makeshift French field hospital. He remembered his name, his rank, but little else. The blow to his head had stolen much of his memory, leaving behind a tattered tapestry of images. A grand, cold house, a woman's face, pale and sad, the glint of a gold ring. He was transferred to a prison camp, a squalid, disease-ridden place where men lost hope before they lost their lives. He was just another English officer, his title meaningless. He survived on grim determination and the fragmented memories that flickered in the dark. He clung to the image of the sad-eyed woman, convinced she was waiting for him. That conviction was the only thing that kept him alive. He spent 4 years in that hell. When the war finally ended, he was not liberated. He was forgotten, lost in the bureaucratic chaos. He and two other men finally escaped, making a desperate, brutal trek across a scarred and hostile country. He worked his passage back to England on a merchant ship, a gaunt, bearded man in rags, unrecognizable as the proud duke who had ridden off to war. He arrived in London expecting, he wasn't sure what, a world restored. Instead, he found a world stolen. He went to his solicitor, a man who had served his family for 40 years. The man stared at him as if he were an apparition, then broke down and wept. The story he was told was neat and tidy. He had been declared dead. His cousin, Valerius, had inherited, and his wife, the Duchess Alara, had died of a broken heart a few months after receiving the news. She was buried in the family crypt at Wyndham Court. Alistair felt a cold, dead weight settle in his soul. The woman he had fought his way back to was gone. The hope that had sustained him was extinguished. He was too late. He went to Wyndham Court. Valerius greeted him not with shock or relief, but with a flicker of pure, unadulterated fear, quickly masked by a flawless performance of astonishment. He embraced Alistair, called for champagne, hailed his miraculous return. But his eyes were cold and watchful. The house felt wrong. Valerius had changed things. New paintings hung on the walls, garish and modern. The staff was different, their faces unfamiliar and sullen. It was his home, but he was a stranger in it. He asked to see Alara's grave. Valerius led him to the crypt, his expression one of perfect solemnity. He stood before the marble sarcophagus, her name carved into the stone. Alara Wyndham, beloved Duchess. It felt like a lie. Doubt began as a small, insidious seed. Valerius's story was too smooth. The staff's sympathy felt rehearsed. He started to ask questions, quietly at first. He spoke to the old gatekeeper, one of the few servants Valerius had not dismissed. The man was nervous, his eyes darting towards the main house. "The Duchess, my lord. She was with child when the news came," the old man whispered, his voice trembling. "Lord Valerius, he said she lost it in her grief, wasted away after that." A child. The word struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. Alara had been pregnant. She had never told him. Or had she? A vague memory surfaced, a letter he never received. He remembered her face in the weeks before he left, pale and strained. He had thought it was worry. He had been a blind, self-absorbed fool. He hired a private investigator in London, a discreet man recommended by his solicitor. He wanted to know everything about Alara's final months. The man began to dig. He uncovered whispers, rumors, a large sum of money withdrawn from the Duchess's personal accounts the day after she supposedly took to her bed in grief. A maid, dismissed shortly after, who spoke of the Duchess packing a simple traveling bag. A coachman who remembered a veiled lady in mourning clothes buying a ticket west. The pieces did not fit the story of a woman dying of grief. They fit the story of a woman running for her life. The investigator traced the path of the mysterious woman west, a trail that had gone cold 6 years ago. But he was persistent. He found a midwife in a small town who remembered treating a gentlewoman, a Mrs. Ellery, who was new to the area and expecting her first child. The description matched Alara. From there, the trail led, finally, to Porthgallo. Alistair traveled to Cornwall himself. He left the grandeur of Wyndham Court behind, dressing in the simple, rough clothes of a traveler. He did not want to arrive as a duke. He wanted to arrive as a man searching for his wife. And so he found himself at dawn, standing before a windswept cottage, his world irrevocably shattered and remade by the sight of a small boy with his eyes in his ring. The confrontation on the doorstep was brutal and brief. Alara's shock gave way to a glacial fury. She saw not the man who had suffered, but the man who had failed her. "Leave," she said, her voice low and trembling with a rage that had simmered for 6 years. "You have no place here. We have a life. It is not the one you left us to, but it is ours." "Alara, "You must listen to me," he pleaded, his voice hoarse. "I was a prisoner. I was wounded. I never stopped trying to get back to you." "You were dead," she countered, her gray eyes flashing. "A convenient death that left me at the mercy of your vulture of a cousin. Did you arrange it all so neatly, Your Grace? Rid yourself of an inconvenient wife so you could play the hero?" The accusation was so monstrous, so far from the truth, that it left him speechless. He saw the depth of her pain, the narrative she had constructed to survive. In her story, he was not a victim. He was the villain. It was easier to be angry at a man who had abandoned her than to grieve a man who was lost. "That is not what happened," he said, his voice raw. "Valerius lied. He lied about everything." "I have no reason to believe you," she said, pulling Arthur closer. The boy looked from his mother's taut face to the stranger's anguished one, his expression confused and frightened. "Then I will give you a reason," Alistair said. He did not try to force his way in. He did not command her. He looked at his son, his heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. "I will not leave this village until you listen to the truth." He turned and walked away, his stiff leg dragging slightly on the uneven ground. He did not look back. He knew her eyes were on him, filled with hatred and confusion. He had to let her have her anger. It was all she had left. He took a room at the Salty Dog, the village's only inn. The room was small and damp, overlooking the noisy, reeking harbor. The bed was lumpy. The sheets were coarse. It was luxury compared to the prison camp. He sent a message to his investigator in London. "Send everything. The documents, the witnesses. Bring them here." His presence in Porthgallo was an immediate source of gossip. A tall, scarred gentleman of obvious quality, staying at the inn, doing nothing but walking the cliff paths and staring out to sea. He made a point of avoiding Alara's cottage, giving her the space she needed. But he was always there, a silent, watchful presence at the edge of her world. He saw her at the market, her basket on her arm, her head held high as she bartered for vegetables. He saw her on the beach with Arthur, helping him search for shells. He saw the strength in her, the competence. This was not the fragile duchess he had married. This was a woman forged in fire, and he loved her more than he had ever thought possible. He began to try, in small ways, to break through the wall of her anger. He saw that her woodpile was low. The next morning, a large stack of perfectly chopped and seasoned oak appeared by her back door. He noticed the gate on her small garden was broken. A day later, it was mended, the hinges oiled and swinging silently. He left a basket of fresh bread and cheese from the inn on her doorstep. She never acknowledged the gestures, but the wood was used. The gate was closed each night. The basket was taken inside. They were small, silent concessions. His greatest challenge, and his greatest hope, was Arthur. The boy was curious about the sad man who looked like him. He would see Alistair in the village and watch him with wide, solemn eyes. One afternoon, Alistair was sitting on the harbor wall, mending a fishing net for one of the old fishermen, a skill he'd learned out of sheer boredom in prison. Arthur approached him, clutching his wooden soldier. "Can you fix this?" the boy asked, holding out the toy. Its arm was broken. Alistair's hands, which had once signed ducal decrees, were clumsy, but he took the toy gently. "I can try." He took a piece of twine from his pocket and a small clasp knife and carefully, painstakingly bound the soldier's arm, making it strong again. He handed it back to Arthur. The boy inspected the repair with a critical eye. "You're good at fixing things," he said. "I'm trying to be," Alistair replied, his voice thick with unspoken meaning. "My father was a duke," Arthur announced proudly. "He died in the war." Alistair's heart clenched. "He sounds like a very brave man." "Mama says he was, but she cries sometimes when she says it." The boy looked down at his shoes. "She doesn't cry anymore. Now she just looks angry." He looked up at Alistair, his blue eyes startlingly direct. "Is it because of you?" "Yes," Alistair said honestly. "I'm afraid it is." The proof from London arrived a week later. It came in the form of Mr. Abernathy, his solicitor, a small, fussy man completely out of his element in the rustic village, and a grizzled, one-armed sergeant who had been in the prison camp with Alistair. Alistair did not summon Elira. He went to her. He knocked on her door in the late afternoon, the two men standing behind him. She opened it, her face set in harsh lines. "I told you to leave us alone." "5 minutes, Elira," he said quietly. "That's all I ask. Hear what they have to say. If you still want me to go after that, I will walk away and never return. You have my word." She hesitated, her gaze flickering from his face to the two strangers. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the bone-deep weariness. She stepped back, allowing them to enter the tiny, cramped cottage. For the next hour, she listened. The sergeant told his story in a plain, unvarnished soldier's tongue, describing the battle, the capture, the years of starvation and sickness in the camp. He described Alistair's head wound, his delirium, his unwavering belief that he had to get home to his wife. Then Abernathy laid out his evidence on the small wooden table: forged death certificates, bank records showing Valerius systematically selling off unentailed properties, a sworn statement from the maid who had been dismissed, testifying that Valerius had bragged about intercepting the Duchess's mail. And finally, the most damning piece of all, the charred remnants of the letter Elira had written to Alistair, telling him about their child, retrieved from a fireplace at Wyndham Court by a sympathetic footman. Elira stared at the burned scraps of paper, her own handwriting faint but visible. The truth, cold and undeniable, settled over her. The narrative she had built, the one that had protected her, crumbled into dust. He had not abandoned her. He had been stolen from her. They both had. The rage drained away, leaving behind a vast, hollow ache of grief for the years they had lost, for the life that had been taken from them. She looked at Alistair, truly looked at him for the first time since his return. She saw the silver in his dark hair, the fine lines of pain etched around his eyes, the deep scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. She saw the man who had survived hell to come back to her. Tears, hot and silent, began to trace paths down her cheeks. He did not move to comfort her. He stood his ground, letting her see him, letting her grieve. He had to let her come to him. The final act of the drama unfolded not in London, but in Porthgallo. Alistair sent word to Valerius that he wished to discuss the terms of the transition. He named the village inn as the meeting place. Valerius, arrogant and secure in his power, arrived in a grand carriage, a man coming to swat a fly. He found Alistair waiting in the inn's private parlor. But he was not alone. Abernathy was there, as was the local magistrate, a stern, unsmiling man. Valerius's face paled. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning, cousin," Alistair said, his voice quiet and cold, "is that your tenancy at Wyndham Court is over." He laid out the evidence, piece by damning piece, the fraud, the theft, the forgery. The magistrate listened, his expression grim. Valerius blustered and threatened, but the proof was irrefutable. He was ruined. By the time he left the inn, he was no longer a duke. He was a common criminal, facing charges that would see him transported or imprisoned for life. His reign was over. That night, a storm rolled in from the sea, lashing the village with wind and rain. A fever took hold of Arthur. It was a simple childhood ailment, but in the small, drafty cottage, it felt terrifying. His skin was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow. Elira bathed his forehead with cool water, her heart tight with fear. There was a knock at the door. It was Alistair, his coat soaked through. "I saw the doctor's lantern," he said simply. "Let me help." She was too tired, too frightened to refuse. He came in, shedding his wet coat, and was instantly a calm, steadying presence in the chaotic little room. He held Arthur's hand, murmuring quiet, soothing words. He built up the fire, his movements efficient and sure. He sat with her through the long night, not as a duke, but as a father, sharing her vigil, her fear. In the darkest hour, just before dawn, the fever broke. Arthur's breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Ilara sagged with relief, the tension of the last few hours leaving her weak. She looked at Alistair across the small room, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. He looked exhausted, but his eyes, when they met hers, were full of a deep, unwavering tenderness. "Thank you," she whispered. "He is my son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I would burn the world for him, for you." In the quiet stillness of the cottage, with the storm outside beginning to fade and their son sleeping safely between them, the last of the ice around her heart melted. This man was not the cold, distant stranger she had married. War and suffering had stripped him of his arrogance, leaving behind the man he was always meant to be. Humble, strong, true. "Alistair," she said, using his name for the first time. He looked up, hope dawning in his eyes. "I think," she said, a small watery smile touching her lips, "it is time for us to go home." Returning to Wyndham Court was like stepping into a life that belonged to someone else, but this time it was different. They returned not as a duke and his duchess, but as Alistair and Ilara, partners who had fought their way back to each other. The house was cleansed of Valerius's presence. Ilara walked through the grand rooms, no longer intimidated by their scale. She had lived in 2 rooms and been more content than she ever was here. She knew now that a home was not made of stone and silk, but of the people within it. She brought the sea air with her. She ordered the heavy velvet curtains taken down, letting the sunlight stream in. She filled the vases with wildflowers from the meadows, not hothouse roses. The connecting door between their chambers was thrown open and never closed again. Alistair was a changed man. He took his duties as duke seriously, but he no longer hid behind them. He spent his days not just with his estate manager, but with his tenants, listening to their concerns, learning their names. He used his considerable wealth and influence to establish a fund for wounded veterans and their families, ensuring no other soldier was forgotten as he had been. But his most important work was within the walls of his own home. He was a father to Arthur, patient and present. He taught him to ride, not on a docile pony, but on a proper horse, his hands steady on the reins. He read him stories at night, his voice a low, comforting rumble. He courted his own wife. He learned her thoughts, her dreams. He brought her tea in the mornings and sat with her in the gardens in the evenings, not speaking of estates or politics, but of their son, of the future, of the simple, profound joy of being together. He earned her trust, her respect, and finally, her love, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet consistency of his devotion. One late summer afternoon, they were walking in the rose garden. The air was warm and smelled of sun-baked earth and blooming flowers. Arthur, now 7, ran ahead, chasing a butterfly, his laughter echoing in the still air. Alistair stopped and took Ilara's hand. His own was warm and strong, the scars a testament to all he had endured. On his finger, the ducal signet ring gleamed, the onyx stone dark and solid. It was no longer a symbol of ownership, but a symbol of his promise, of his place by her side. "Are you happy, Ilara?" he asked, his blue eyes searching her face. She looked at her husband, the man she had lost and found. She looked at her son, a perfect blend of them both, running free and fearless in the sun. She thought of the cold, silent woman she had been, and the strong, resilient woman she had become. The journey had been brutal, the cost immense, but it had led them here. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure. "I am home.